There are very few things that bring me as much satisfaction as walking into my wood shop with an idea and a need, and then pulling out some old scrap wood and bringing that idea to life. Solving problems and figuring out how to get things to work is one of the most satisfying parts of woodworking, and that's what we're going to do today. So buckle up, because we're going to take just a few minutes and learn how to take some scrap wood and an idea and turn it into a unique and useful coat rack. And it's a coat rack that you really haven't seen before. So let's dive right in. Now, to begin with, I'm going to take some old white oak. This is a white oak board that I believe came out of a barn. So it is a scrap piece of wood. It's got some nails in it that I had to pull out, and I'm going to cut it down into 12-inch pieces, which you really don't need 12-inch pieces. I'm making it larger than it needs to be to begin with, knowing that I can trim it down later. Step one is to mill the wood, so let's plane it down in the thickness planer. Then I'll take it to the table saw and cut it down to 1.5-inch thick pieces. Now you'll notice right here that I'm actually using a thin rip jig. I actually like using the thin rip jig because it's a little bit quicker. Instead of having to accurately remeasure your rip fence every time your stock gets smaller, we just set the thin rip jig in the proper location, and then we push our rip fence up to keep it tight. Now notice that we keep the thin rip jig in front of the blade. You don't want to move it back into the blade, because that increases the possibility that you can have your material bind up and kick back. Once we have all of our pieces, then I'm just going to pull out the old palm router and a round over bit, and I'm going to break those hard edges. Then let's come back to our scrap wood bin and find some old scraps of walnut, because we're going to use that as separators between each one of the spindles. I have a hard time throwing away hardwood, especially walnut. I keep even the smallest scraps. Then we'll bring that back over to the planer and mill that down. Now, the actual size really doesn't matter. You can do what you like. I'm making them 1.5 inches deep, which is the same depth as the spindles, and 3/4 of an inch wide, which is simply based on the thickness of the boards once they're plain. Once we have the majority of our pieces, let's lay everything out. Pick the good sides and make sure that everything looks good. Since we're actually looking at the back of the coat rack now, any imperfections or knots can be right there in the back. Once we see how it lines up, let's get a quick measurement. And this is going to be our backer board. Now, there are actually going to be 3 pieces. There's going to be one piece at the bottom, which the spindles are going to bump up against to. And then we're going to have a French cleat on the top. So this makes it easy and very stable to be able to mount it to the wall. Now you can make this any width you like. You can also change it up a little bit, maybe put designs inside each of the separators, or have a key rack in the middle. And one thing that I've thought about doing is that in future builds of this. So I'm going to clamp this up just so I can make sure that everything is nice and straight. And the next step is to pre-drill the holes and countersink. Now, I rushed through this a little bit. You'll notice that a couple of those screw holes aren't quite centered, but it's not a big deal. It still works fine. Once we have it pre-drilled, we're fine. Now, I realize that the spindles are taller than they really need to be, so I'm going to cut those down by about 3 inches. And I'm going to cut them at an angle so that when I pull it down, it butts up against the back of the coat rack. Then we're going to go over to the drill press and cut our holes, because we're just going to put a dowel through all these, and that's what's going to allow them to rotate. Now, in hindsight, I really should have put those dowel holes a little bit further down toward the bottom. You don't really see it in the video because I didn't film it, but these spindles don't like to drop the entire distance. And I did go back to my miter saw and I cut it so that those bottom angles were actually much closer to the dowel hole. From there, we're going to go ahead and assemble all of our spindles and separators. I'm just going to put a little paste wax on there to make it a little bit easier to get everything in. Now, there's no right or wrong as to the actual size of each one. I thought it would be interesting to have each spindle be taller or shorter. That's not necessarily a functional decision. I just thought it would look neat. And the dowels aren't quite long enough, but no big deal. When I get to the middle, I'll just stick one dowel into one side of that middle piece and the other into the other side. If everything's mounted and screwed and glued tight, shouldn't be a problem. So now that I see the way it's going to look, I'm going to do a quick little glue up here. And this piece is what the spindles are going to bump up against so that they don't hit the wall when you drop each one of those spindles. Now this is optional, but in case those spindles want to drop forward and they don't want to stand up straight, if you don't have it tight enough, you can put magnets in there and then put the corresponding magnet on the back of the spindle. That turns into a handy little feature that will help make sure all the spindles stay upright when they're not in use. We'll just use a little CA glue and accelerator, and now it's time to mount everything up. Just using 2 pieces of a French cleat, drop it into place. And we can now easily put all of our coats on our new fancy coat rack. Hey, thank you for sticking around for the entire video. And if you haven't done so, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button down below and maybe leave a like and a comment. Those simple little interactions encourage YouTube to promote this video out to a wider audience. And if you'd like to see more easy to create projects to improve your woodworking skills, take a look at the playlist in the description down below and in the pinned comment.